So I wanted to designate this episode to celebrate womanhood. And I know in a lot of parts of the world, there are still a lot of inequality and women are still fighting for their rights. So I just wanted to raise a little awareness about where we stand in the world as women and to celebrate us who need to juggle between motherhood and running the family household successfully, having a good marriage, finding a career or passion, feeling fulfilled and accomplished in our life, and finding our place in this world, and knowing what we can do and what we're capable to achieve. So, since this podcast is about weddings, I thought it would be fun to kind of I did some research about how a long time ago how it used to be, the long old traditions where these traditions put women and what they were allowed to do, not allowed to do, why they were supposed to do some type of traditions during the wedding. And I thought that would be a fun little topic to chat about. So let's see what equal opportunities and equality we had to fight for when it comes to wedding planning and wedding day. And I will be sharing some traditions that were so old that they're not part of our wedding anymore, but then there are some traditions that got modified, or they have more like a sentimental romantic meaning to it, not so much evil like it used to be originally. And maybe if you know these traditions, you can decide to break them or not to have them on your wedding day because you will think that's just horrible. You don't want to have that. Or maybe you will just have a good laugh and incorporate it anyway, because really weddings are all about celebrating and having fun. And I don't think we should take these too seriously, but it's certainly good to know where they're coming from. And I already talked about a couple of topics that are tied to our wedding planning and are expected from a specific gender as our society. For example, I had the episode number 6, I talked about proposal traditions where our society expects that the man propose to the woman. Or I talked in the episode number 15 about name changing after your marriage, which is also something that's expected from women to do in most of the countries and cultures. So I don't know how much research you guys did, or if you guys heard anything about old wedding traditions and where all of these rituals coming from. But women used to be objectified and used as an object on weddings. When it was time to get married, it was literally a transaction between a father and a husband, and that's where the tradition of handing over, the father walks down the aisle with the bride and hands it over to the husband. That was because that's how it literally happened. They made this transaction for some kind of financial reasons or for peace. But today we do that more to honor our father, and it has the more romantic and sentimental feel to it as you say goodbye to your old life where you lived with your family. So don't panic if you didn't know about this tradition and you feel horrible that you want to have your father walking you down the aisle, or you already did that, because it really has a more sentimental feel to it right now. But just that's where this tradition is coming from. So in many cultures, a bride would wear a white dress and have a veil over their face to cover themselves. And long time ago, they had these veils would cover their whole body. And I know that most of you know that they were wearing white and their faces were covered to symbolize their modesty, their untouchedness. I don't know how you say that. The reason they really cover them is when they had these arranged marriages, and so the husband can't see the wife. They don't, if they're ugly or they don't like the way they look. So they had to get married before the husband was even able to see the wife. So they would say yes, and that's after that is when the husband lifts up the veil and kind of reveals who his wife is going to be, which is kind of crazy. And for that same reason, the first look was happening at the actual ceremony, when these days, mostly photographers, I think this tradition comes from photographers, that they would suggest to have a first look before the ceremony so they can have some good pictures of seeing the couple seeing each other for the first time, taking off this pressure off of their shoulder. But the tradition of husband or fiance not seeing the wife, the bride, before the wedding, it kind of is still sticked with this tradition. So I think it got a little bit modified, that it's a bad luck to see the bride before the wedding, but it kind of ties up with this same tradition to have the first look and to see the bride for the first time at the actual ceremony, which comes from arranged marriages when they didn't really know who they're getting married to. These days, the tradition says that bridesmaids would wear a same dress, but that's really pretty, like the bride's dress, but it's not really the same. So they're not literally wearing the same dress that the bride is. But long time ago, all these girls would wear the same dress what the bride was wearing, because they believed that way they will confuse the evil spirits, and if there's some evil spirit that comes into the wedding, they wouldn't know which one is actually the bride. So that's why they had this type of shield with all of these other women who would protect the bride, and that's where the tradition of bridesmaids come from. Also, I know that in most weddings, usually it's the man, the father, or the husband who speaks up to give a toast after the wedding when they have a reception and they're eating dinner. It's usually the husband who stands up and gives a toast and thanks everybody for coming. And this also comes from or old traditions when women were not allowed to speak up, to say anything. They wouldn't even given an opportunity, and they weren't allowed to speak up on a wedding day, and that's where this tradition comes from. The groom would pick up his new wife and carry her over the door when they go to their new home, because they believed that with the bride's feet, the evil spirit would slip into the house, so they had to lift up the bride so the bad spirit doesn't goes into the house. The honeymoon tradition also comes from the husband taking the wife away from her family and hiding her somewhere for months. Actually, that's how he was trying to keep the wife away from her family, and also they would wait until the wife gets pregnant, and that was the time when she was allowed to come out of that hiding place. Something borrowed. This is a very sentimental tradition here in America. The woman would have something borrowed, so like their grandma's jewelry or earring, they would wear it on themselves to bring them good luck. But this tradition comes from when the bride would have to wear another woman's underwear who already had babies, so she already has children, to bring a good luck, fertility, so the bride can also become pregnant with wearing that underwear and bringing her a good luck. So that's also a little bit of creepy tradition. Two of the worst traditions for women, I think it was, one of them is tearing the bride's dress off, because the bride was considered lucky on that day. All of these guests would want to get some of that luck for themselves, so they would tear a piece of her dress off of her until she wasn't wearing anything, literally. And the second most horrible tradition for a woman was the garter toss, which originated from when at the weddings, when the bride and the groom had to basically have this bedding ceremony right after they said their vows, and they had these witnesses who watched them, and then the the husband, to show their successfulness, he had to throw the wife's undergarment or something in a crowd. I don't know what it was originally, but all of this sounds really creepy and pretty bad for the woman. And don't freak out if you are already planning to have a garter toss because of this tradition. I know that a lot of brides these days are trying to shy away from this tradition for that reason, but if you find it fun and enjoyable to have this tradition at your wedding, then why not, having fun with the people that you are there with to celebrate. So all of these traditions are just used to be a long time ago, like I mentioned it already. If you as a woman, as a bride, you feel like you do want to wear a veil or have a bouquet, not because you smell bad. On every other these reasons and traditions, if you want to follow them, or your dad to hand you to your husband, it's not a transaction anymore. Just want to encourage you that that's not why I'm sharing all of this, that because I want to discourage you and tell you not to do any of this on your wedding day. Oh, and then the bouquet toss was done because when all the guests would try to tear a piece of dress off of the bride, then she would throw the bouquet in a crowd far away so they can kind of be distracted and turn that way and run to get the bouquet. So that's when that's coming from. And we also have in Hungary some Hungarian wedding traditions that are, I don't think they have it in other places, that are pretty specific for a woman. One of them is wearing a red dress right after midnight. So on your wedding day, usually in Hungary, we celebrate, we have the wedding reception all the way until the morning. So at midnight, the bride would go and come back in a red dress, and that symbolizes that she became a wife, a woman. And the other tradition is stealing the bride. Somebody at the wedding would pick up the bride and steal her and take her somewhere, and then the husband has to go and find her and usually give something for exchange. So these are some of the bigger traditions and their origins. It was interesting to me to think about how do these traditions play out when there isn't any specific gender role. So in same-sex marriages, what are some of these old traditions that are not applicable, and what are some of them that can be? For example, like the veil or the bouquet, some of these obvious things. But there are some traditions that comes from man owning the woman, or man being in control with everything. And it's a really interesting thought when there is no man. As I was getting ready for this episode, I was thinking, how funny is it that these traditions go back for so long, and they have most of them have a pretty weird and creepy and twisted reason, especially for women. These days, in modern days, if you don't do these traditions, if you modify the traditions, if you leave something out, then your wedding automatically becomes a non-traditional wedding. So it's really funny how we are treating these traditions in our life, just throughout anything else, not just wedding, that we are trying to be very traditional, or we're trying to be very non-traditional, but without really thinking about the true meaning of it, and without considering it as something that had old history, or something that's just modified for our own enjoyment. Okay, so let's jump back to our modern days and modern ages, and I wanted to talk a little bit more about women's role in the wedding planning today. I feel like with all the media and society, there is still so much pressure on women when it comes to the wedding planning itself. after you get engaged, it feels like everybody's asking you these questions. You need to make these decisions, timeline, to-dos, and what to buy and how much money to spend and which vendor to pick. Your groom is not expected to play any role into the wedding planning or to do anything. So I would want to encourage you to have this conversation with your partner after you get engaged. Maybe you already did, of how you two can divide the to-do list and divide up wedding planning, and to just make sure that you two are equally involved in the wedding planning, because marriage is really about the two of you. You two have to work the same way in your marriage, on your relationship, as a parent, as a homeowner, or anything pretty much in your life. You have to make decisions together. So do the same on your wedding planning, because if you haven't lived together before, if you don't live together right now, it's a good practice to do something together. And for all of my multicultural couples, multicultural listeners, for us, beside all of these crazy wedding traditions and wedding roles and women's role in a weddings, gets even more complicated when it comes to planning a cultural wedding, and when we have to blend traditions together. But I think this is a really good way to rethink what truly these traditions represent and what they truly where they come from and why are we doing them. And then after that, you can decide if you want to implement it into your wedding or not. If there's a tradition that comes from your partner's side that you were unfamiliar with, is it something that you want to implement, want to honor, or you don't want to be associated with, or you just think it's something that sounds pretty fun and enjoyable to do and you don't care about where it comes from, then that's fine too. Alright guys, I hope this episode was able to give you some good conversation starters with your partner or with your family. And next week, I have a little bit of question that I'm going to be asking myself, and that's, am I losing my cultural identity? I feel like living somewhere, living abroad, away from my culture, away from my country for 10 years makes me think sometimes that maybe I'm losing my Hungarian heritage, losing my cultural identity. So that's what I'm going to be talking about next week. Until then, have a great day, and I will talk to you next week. Bye, guys.